Well, we decided months ago to end this theme year on the generous life with grace. A concept everyone loves and few understand, a simple word, something we throw around, but it has a deep and abiding meaning. It took me another round of reading to come back to it myself. Tony Campolo, the Red Line Christian who knows a thing or two about grace, said he was talking with a group of junior high schoolers about it. He asked them, what's the difference between grace and mercy and justice? One kid raised his hand and said, if a cop pulls you over for speeding and gives you a ticket, that's justice. And if a cop pulls you over, he said, for speeding and gives you a warning, that's mercy. But he said, if a cop pulls you over for speeding and gives you a Krispy Kreme donut, that's grace. Campolo agreed. He said, those are unparalleled blessings. The often quoted minister I read from, Frederick Buechner, said grace is something we can never get but can only be given. There's no way to earn it or deserve it or bring it about any more than you can, the taste of wonderful things, the love of others. These definitions are all awesome, I think, but they leave us a little flat, if you ask me, because they kind of say grace is, you kind of know it when you see it. So I asked, is someone holding the door for me coming into the sanctuary grace? Or is it just civility? Is a child I witnessed handing over half a donut to a friend on the playground of the church grace or generosity? Or is it just unsanitary? These questions push me for more theology, so let's get into it. There are two aspects of grace I think we have to deal with. One is about human relations, which you and I know a lot about, especially when dealing with right troublemakers and mean-spirited people, ourselves included. And the other is God's grace, which half of you don't want to hear about, but the same half might be able to use on your families when they're praying for you. The other half may be just happy to listen in. So the human grace. First, a story I read of a chaplain in a college who had a girl come into his office to come out as a lesbian to him. She was worried that her father, who was religious in the traditional sense, would disown her. The chaplain looked at her and said, let's find out. And he reached for the phone. And he picked up the phone and he dialed her father's number and he said, I want to tell you something about your daughter. She comes into the office every week and helps us serve the poor. And she is a leader among students and she is kind and gentle. She has a deep, abiding spirit about her. And the father said, tell me something I don't know about my daughter. The father said, she does the same at home. She's a leader in the church. She leads the efforts to visit the elderly in the summer. She's a joy to be around. So the chaplain said, now let me tell you something you don't know. In the next 30 seconds, my friend, I'm going to find out whether you are worthy to be called her father. Are you ready? The good news was that the father responded to this news by saying, she is my daughter. I love her. She always has a place in our church, our family, and in my heart. Grace. It won out over legalism and prejudice and doctrine. By all accounts, the father should have hung up, upset, at what he had heard about his daughter. And we don't know if he rescinded later, for sure. But we know that moment, at least, was a short moment of grace. I have seen such moments many times. And I have seen its opposite. I didn't have to spend 5 minutes working on the AIDS ward at San Francisco General Hospital to know how gay men and women were rejected, cast out, and destroyed by their churches, their families, by doctrine, legalism, and prejudice. Sometimes grace won out, and a lot of times it didn't. Families were cruel to each other, more often than not. They condemned their adult children. They cast them out of their families. In some cases, refused to come to the hospital in the dying days of their children. The tragedy was that we, the chaplains and the nurses and the friends who gathered, were sometimes the only ones there to mourn the loss. But once in a while, something would surprise us. Not only the healing of old wounds or the reconciliations of families, but someone would go the extra mile to celebrate the dying loved one. Once in the midst of the depth and despair of death that hung over the AIDS floor on the 5th level at San Francisco General, I heard a commotion break out down the hall. A happy commotion. A birthday party had broken out. Family had come to love on their jaundiced, bloated child. The party had balloons and cake and singing and family who came from far away dressed in drab clothes of a country village. And it also had flamboyant friends in heels and boas. The feeling was that this party gave us a temporary stay of execution. And while it was brief, it felt like grace. Now the other kind of grace, God's grace, the theological. We heard the story of our ancestors, our Universalist ancestors, who would remind people that God was too big to condemn us forever. What amount of sin could be so bad as to justify eternal damnation, they said, and what kind of God would do that anyway? You can use this on your family members who are praying for you. You can say, what amount of sin could be so bad as to justify eternal damnation? What kind of God would do that anyway? In the theological discourse, we ask, is God loving or just? And the scripture claims both, that God is just and loving. In Deuteronomy 32:4, it reads, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. And John 4 verses 8 says, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. We didn't quote a lot of John 4 verses 8 in the church I grew up in, a Unitarian Universalist, but that's what we learned, that God is love. And so is there a hierarchy between justice and love? Why would God create and condemn? And what about salvation? These are the questions that arise in this conversation, this theological conversation. Your relatives might say that you will burn eternally if you don't accept Jesus Christ. Have you heard that before? Just nod if you're awake. The Universalists said they accepted Jesus, who would never participate in eternal condemnation. The Traditionalists said the unbeliever would roast, even those who had never heard of Jesus. The Universalists said even if they roast, it is just to push them closer to God the loving Father, and a great aloe would be spread over their bodies in heaven. They didn't actually say that, but I added that. The traditionalists point out that Jesus was on the cross. They said the cross work of Christ is instructive regarding the nature of God's justice. Hope for salvation rests on the death of Christ, that on the cross, he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf. Anybody ever heard that before? To which the Unitarians and the Universalists have said, if the cross is not the essential part of the story, the claims like that have nowhere to land. Because for us, the cross was betrayal. Perhaps a collective sin, but not assuaged by one man's death. For the Unitarians and the Universalists, the focus was on Jesus, on his acts, and on his teachings. Now, this is a major dividing point and a tough one to overcome. For us, Jesus wasn't God's son any more than the other poor people who were hanging on crosses up and down the streets of Jerusalem, put there by the Romans. For us, Jesus pointed in the direction of godliness. He taught to see beyond the laws to a deep generosity of spirit, upended the paradigms of the established religion. He said love and mercy were higher values than duty and status. He was not the God that they claimed him to be, our people said. But he pointed to godliness. The half-truth of all this conjecture is that when it comes to God, of course, maybe all of us are wrong. How could we know? How can we know much about the indescribable? How can we know much about the mystery that is beyond and within us? One way we say we know is in moments that break through, moments that upend the paradigms, moments that tell us that love and mercy are more important than status and law. Those are clues that we have about God and God's grace. So a story. It's a story about Maya Angelou. Do you know Maya Angelou? If you haven't read Maya Angelou, you have not lived. Famous African-American writer, poet, Renaissance woman who came up out of the deep South and the prejudice of her life and upbringing and unleashed the great power of poetry and word, freeing people from the shackles. She was speaking in San Francisco some years ago, and she told of preparing for a television show that she was going to give on public TV about African art. She was preparing, and a man had called her and introduced himself, saying he had just what she needed, that he had spent a lot of time in Africa collecting statues and sculptures. So they struck up a conversation, she said in this lecture. They spent days laughing and talking and witnessing this timeless feeling embedded in the pieces that he had. She used those pieces in her show on African art. And some years went by and they lost touch until she was back a few years later in the Bay Area, and she called him and she told him what she was working on and asked, "What are you working on?" And he said, "I've been working with the U.S. troops stationed in Europe." She said, "How did that go?" He said, "Well, the black troops have a particularly difficult time, but there aren't many black folks there, but our boys are." And she said, "What did you say?" And he said, "I've been working with the black troops, and they don't have a lot of people there, but our boys are." And she said, "What? Can you repeat that?" And he said, "I've been working with the black troops because they don't have much there, but our boys are. And she said, again? And he realized what he had done. He said he was embarrassed. He couldn't continue to talk. And he was sorry and he wanted to hang up. And she said, wait, stay on. This is what engaging racial prejudice is all about. It's getting below the surface, realizing our assumptions, black boys, our boys. They finished the conversation, and later she tried to reach him and left many messages, but she never heard back. As she told this story of the phone call and the embarrassment of him understanding as a white man that he had made a mistake of dividing black troops and our troops, she began to weep, and she had to stop the lecture. The next night she continued her lecture, and she told another story. She said the night before, after being moved by telling the story about her friendship, when she was leaving the lecture hall, a man in the audience stood up and said, "Here I am." And it was the man she had just spoken of. That second night, she had this small white man who turned out to be an Episcopal priest stand up and come forward onto the stage, and on the stage they embraced and they wept together. Is this grace? You see, in that moment, the people understood that racial and other barriers separate us. Distrust and hatred and assumptions and a lack of faith in humanity, our inability to communicate, separate us. And we walk through life like a drunken, unworthy son, ineligible, feeling like we are ineligible for a father's love or God's love. Or like a lesbian daughter, fearful of being cast out of the family. We walk through life afraid to touch each other, to speak the truth, to love a stranger. In that moment, the crowd saw that no one was untouchable, that God is among us, that what we hope for is always here, that our goals for each other can be embodied in a moment when a small white man who had made a mistake is embraced by a large black woman and they weep together because they are modeling something bigger than us all. Modeling it for the people in that lecture that night, and for us, the church, now that you have heard the story. And it reminds us what the church is here for. That when the church doesn't embody that kind of forgiveness and grace, it is empty and it is a farce. It is a superficial, lonely place where we hide from each other. But when we do embody that grace, in love and laughter, we are healed by a love of God, by a sense of mutuality, by moments of reconciliation. Is the Maya Angelou story human or God's grace? Do we need to define it or argue about it or box it in? I think not. Mostly we have to just wait for it. We have to notice it when it arrives and when it breaks through in our lives in real and lasting ways. We have to tell someone about it. The late priest, Father Daniel Berrigan, that peacemaker extraordinaire who died this week, said, "Grace is what precedes any fruitful activities anything we can initiate. You see, grace may not be part of generosity. It may be the other way around. Generosity and the generous life has been served up in this sanctuary so many times this year in the form of presents and friendship and giving time and mentors and kindness and forgiveness. But the main message of this theme year could be that the generous life will never fail you if you practice it, if you love it, if you live it. We said on the first day of this theme year, give, change lives, repeat, meaning engage with moments of grace. The generous life has been here all the time, a gift of the God of many names, right here for us to share. So friends, as we end this theme year, be on the lookout for grace, for a mutual, momentary awe, for reconciliation no one planned and no one expected, for a love so great we can hardly hold it. Grace, friends, the highest form of generosity. Seek it and you will find it. And if all else fails, seek justice when appropriate, mercy often, or at last, maybe take a moment and give someone a donut. Amen.